Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black, and today's lesson is on using a Mac for software development. Now I need to tell you before we begin that I am definitely biased against using Mac or MacBooks or whatever, simply because I've always used Windows or Linux for my software development life. That is, after the olden days when I wrote software on mainframes and mini computers. But my personal computer world has revolved around Windows and Linux as my development environment. So it came as a surprise to me when my brother-in-law gave me an old MacBook that they were no longer using because they had replaced it, and said, hey, if you want it, you can play around with it. I did play around with it, and I found immediately that I was able to get quokka-prime up and running with very little effort, like a couple hours of effort. And so what I'm going to do in this lesson is explain to you what I did in order to make that happen. So let's get started. So before we get into the hows and the whys related to developing software on a Mac, I want to point out one thing, and that is this. One of the main advantages of running software and developing software on a Mac is that we use so little memory because we don't have the overhead of doing virtual machines and all of the other stuff that comes along with this. In this system, I'm running everything, including PyCharm, including boatloads of tabs in my Chrome application, and I'm only using less than 10 gig of RAM on my Windows system. Because I have to run a VM, I would be at the upper limit of my physical memory. And so this is one reason that I'm thinking perhaps developing on a Mac is a good idea. So why was it so easy to get quokka-prime to run on the Mac? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first one has to do with the operating system. Mac OS and Linux are both based on a Unix-based operating system called FreeBSD. And as such, a lot of the primitives and the commands and the terminal window stuff is similar or the same between the two operating systems. The second reason is that quokka-prime, of course, is written in Python, and as such, it's running on a programming language that is portable between different operating systems. So these two things make it very easy to port code between something like Ubuntu and the Mac. Now, in order to develop software on the Mac, the first thing that you need to do is to install something called XCode command line tools onto your Mac environment. And this will enable all of the Linux or Unix-based tools that we're so familiar with to be installed. Here you can see I'm typing in Xcode select, and it is telling me that it's already installed. If it's not installed, you will need to install it before you begin to do your other stuff. And one easy way to do it, and this is the nice thing about the Mac, is if I type in a command that I'm going to use like git, here I'm doing git version, and if it wasn't installed, it would prompt me to install it. You can see it's telling me the version. You can see I've already installed it. This window that you see right here is what would pop up. The Mac would be smart enough to detect the fact that, hey, I'm doing something that maybe I need to install command line tools for. So I just Googled this and I found a web page that says things like developers need to install it. It explains a little bit about what the Xcode command line tools. We've been using these on Unix-based operating systems for a long time. And so that's all good. And it also says these are some ways that you can get it installed. And here's the window again that you will see. So install Xcode command line tools, and it will make your development task much easier. Now, the first thing that I did in order to get quokka-prime running on my MacBook is to download and install PyCharm. So I just Googled PyCharm community for Mac, and I came to this page. You can download it and follow the installation instructions. It's really pretty simple. So simple, even somebody like David Bombal can do it. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to pull down my quokka-prime code. I've already done this, so I'm listing my shell history, which is I can use the cat command in order to do that. That's where it's located. And I'm grepping for clone, and that will show me the command that I used in order to get my code from Git down onto my system in the location where I am. That's the command git clone https etc. That's my repository for quokka-prime. If you execute that command, then it will pull down all of the code for you in whatever directory you are located in. So it will create a folder called quokka-prime, and it will have all of the monitoring services as well as the UI stuff and everything else. So that is something that you'll do. If you look here, you can see I've done that, and there's my folder called quokka-prime. That's where the code is located, and now I can begin to do stuff with it. Now that I have PyCharm installed and I have the code pulled down, then all I need to do is load the code into PyCharm. So you can see I've done it before. If you're doing this the first time, then you'll need to find it in the correct folder, but all you need to do is that, and it will load it in. Now, one of the really nice things that I discovered is when PyCharm loads it in, it is going to detect that there are packages that have not been installed yet, and so it is going to go through the process of installing them if I ask it to. So it pops up something up there at the top, and it says, do you want me to load them? And I will say, yes, I do. I've already done this, of course, so I'm not doing it right here. But when I did it the first time, I said yes, and lo and behold, it went out and installed it for me. It saved me all the hassle of doing pip installs for things like Flask and Napalm and all the other stuff. So that is a nice shortcut and a very good thing that PyCharm does for us, and that's what I took advantage of, and that's one of the reasons I was able to get things up and running so quickly. Okay, so you've installed XCode command line tools, you have installed PyCharm, you've pulled down, cloned the code from quokka-prime, and you've opened PyCharm with quokka-prime that perform the function of installing the pip install for all of these different packages that we need. But what about for other stuff? You remember we did apt-get stuff. That apt is a package manager for Ubuntu. There are package managers available for other Linux distributions as well. And you may be asking, what package manager is there for the Mac? And unfortunately, the answer is there isn't one. So there is something, though, that everybody seems to use called Brew. The formal name is called Homebrew. And this is a picture of a stein. I guess it has to do with brewing your own beer or something like that. But Homebrew is the tool that we end up using to perform functions to load packages similar to what we do with the apt-get. Now you can see in my list of Python packages and other stuff that I've installed, this is on the wiki for Quokka, that there are a number of things here, but I'm not really needing any of those or many of those. Postgres I don't need. I don't need the user interface stuff. I do need, however, Nmap. Nmap is what's going to be useful to me for doing port scans, so that is one of the things that I will need to install. So it's ironic, Homebrew is to make your life a lot easier for doing installation of packages, and yet its own installation is ridiculously complicated. So if you look down here at something that is the installation command that you have to give, you can copy it and you can run it. It's difficult to install, but then it makes your life much easier. And if I get rid of this and we look at the terminal window, you can see I have a bunch of brew commands. The top thing is the actual thing to install it. That's what I'm highlighting right here. And then I have all these other brew commands. Now I didn't actually know exactly what I was doing, so some of the things that I'm doing here, all of my commands, you can see my errors as well as successes. Pip and Python, I don't believe I needed to install. One of the downsides of me having no experience with doing this is I was just trying stuff and then it worked and I was amazed and I said, oh, I should have written this down, but I didn't. So what you get to do is see that I don't think you need to install pip or Python. Certainly the PyCharm stuff probably wouldn't have worked if we'd done that, but I just leave that for you, and you're kind of looking over my shoulder as I'm trying to remember that stuff. So there are a number of these commands that you can see. the one that is the most important here is the nmap one. That is where I am installing the stuff that we will later be using for port scan. The libpcap is used for packet capture. I'm not using that right now. You can see I uninstalled Docker. I did install Docker at one point in time, thinking that I would run Mongo in a Docker container. I decided not to do that, so I uninstalled it. You'll also notice that the install of Docker is not there. There are some commands that are not in my history. You can see I've kind of tried to find them with the stuff I just highlighted. But the main thing you have to remember is that you'll want to install this because you will be using it. And this is how you do it. This is the Homebrew page, and it gives you exactly what you need. The one thing that you definitely need is nmap, and as I mentioned, pip and Python. I do not believe you need to be installing those. But that is Brew. That is the basically package manager for the Mac, and that is how you will load your software packages. So the last major step that we need to do is to install MongoDB, since that's the database that quokka-prime uses. Now, in order to do that, I just Googled how to install MongoDB on a Mac, and it gave me this community edition, which is the free one, and all of the instructions, and all I did was follow the instructions. Now, there's some prerequisites. The good news is that we've already done these prerequisites. The first one being XCode select. We've gone through that process of installing XCode to get all of the cool terminal stuff installed on our Mac, so we will do that. The next thing we'll do is make sure we have Brew, so we went to the Homebrew page and installed it. And once we have that, we can begin to execute the brew commands in order to install MongoDB. And the first command that we do is called brew tap. And this one I ran into some problems with, but it eventually resolved itself. I'm going to do a brew tap of MongoDB/brew that installs instructions for the installation process. And once you've done that, then you can just simply do a brew install MongoDB community 5.0. And once that's installed, everything should begin to work. There should not be any more configuration or anything necessary. Just follow the instructions. Okay, let's remind ourselves what we learned in this lesson. In this lesson, we learned that the Mac operating system is Unix-based, the same as Linux-based operating systems like Ubuntu, and consequently, a lot of stuff is portable. We learned that, of course, and we knew that Python is portable, and so we can run this on different systems. We learned that in order to do software development on a Mac, you're going to need to install XCode or XCode Select, which is what we did to give us those command line pieces of functionality that we use in software development. We used PyCharm, which runs on a Mac, and it actually did install all of our Python packages for us. We downloaded quokka-prime, or we cloned it using Git. We realized that we don't have a package management system in the Mac, so this thing called Homebrew, the command being called brew, is what we used. And lastly, we use a database. We use MongoDB, and we use Brew to install it. And even though I went through a couple of hiccups, as I mentioned, I did get it installed. Hopefully you won't encounter that if you choose to do this as well. That's what we learned. Hopefully this little exposure to Mac-based software development has been helpful. And if you have any questions, let me know. And as always, thanks for listening.